Good day, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for your patience as we get started. I'm Amy Southerton, Assistant Director at the Center for the Study of Canada and Institute on Quebec Studies at SUNY Plattsburgh, and it's my true delight to welcome you to another session of the virtual Conversations on Canada series. The Conversations on Canada webinar series is organized by the Center for the Study of Canada and Institute on Quebec Studies at the State University of New York at Plattsburgh, which is the United States Department of Education Title VI National Resource Center on Canada, with additional support from the Quebec Ministry of International Relations and La Francophonie. Conversations on Canada series addresses current issues central to a fuller understanding of Canadian society, with past sessions on a variety of topics, including 1. Why is Donald Trump mad at Canada? Understanding American foreign policy for Canada with Christopher Kirkey of SUNY Plattsburgh. 2. The pandemic experience. How do Canada and the US compare? With Andre Picard of the Globe and Mail. 3. The Black experience in Canada, race, the state, and the persistence of social inequality with Deborah Thompson of McGill University. 4. Home and native land, reconciling experiential Canadas with Bernard Purley, University of British Columbia. 5. What if the US had Canada's notwithstanding clause? Constitutional lessons from the North with Kevin McMahon of Trinity College. 6. Is the special relationship back? Canada-US issues with Joe Biden with Frederic Gagnon of the University of Quebec in Montreal. Recordings of all these past presentations are publicly made available on YouTube. So to view these past sessions, please visit the Conversations on Canada YouTube channel at tinyurl.com/Conversations on Canada. Thank you for joining us, to all of our members of our virtual audience. We're thrilled to be here today with Dr. Christopher Sands, and we're especially grateful to all the SUNY Plattsburgh students, faculty, staff, and alumni, as well as business people and government representatives of our own Northern New York State and far beyond. And of course, our colleagues and scholarly members of the Association for Canadian Studies in the US who are joining us today. For any questions or comments you'd like to submit, please note the Q&A box on your screen. We ask that any questions or comments you have for the panelists be submitted specifically in the Q&A box. And at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Christopher Kirkey, Director of the Center for the Study of Canada and Institute on Quebec Studies at the State University of New York at Plattsburgh.
Thank you, Amy. Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour. Bienvenue à tous. We have a wonderful audience of Canadian American academics, representatives from the business community, government officials, etc., joining us to hear Chris this afternoon. By way of background, Christopher Sands is director of the Wilson Center's Canada Institute. He's a longstanding specialist on Canada, the United States-Canada relationship, North American economic integration. He is the co-host of the Can USA Street podcast and regular panelist on the Wilson Center America's 360 podcast. His most recent book, co-edited with David Thomas from the University of Toronto Press, is titled Canada and the United States, Differences That Count. He serves on a variety of boards, including the Canada-US Law Institute, the Institute for Research on Public Policy, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and the University of California, Berkeley's Canadian Studies program. He's a founding member and officer of the Canadian Politics section of the American Political Science Association and a member of the editorial board for Canadian Foreign Policy Journal, wonderful journal. Chris also is a lecturer at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced and International Studies and directs the Hopkins Center for Canadian Studies. He is a lecturer and course coordinator of the Canada Seminar at the Foreign Service Institute at the United States Department of State. And prior to joining the Wilson Center, he taught in the School of Public Affairs at American University and in the College of Business and Economics at Western Washington University. He's held a Fulbright when he was at Carleton University working on his dissertation a long time ago, I might point out, although it's hard to believe that. He was also senior fellow at Massey College at the University of Toronto. He is sometimes and frequently mistaken, some might suggest, for being a Canadian, but he is actually a native Michigander. He's from Detroit. And we are absolutely thrilled to have Chris here today when we were paying attention to the upcoming electoral cycle here in the United States, not just the presidential election, but obviously congressional elections. We thought it would be super appropriate to have Chris, not simply because of his positionality in Washington, but because he focuses so closely on policy issues related to the Canada-US relationship, to ask him today to join us. And so Chris has generously agreed to do that. And after his remarks, I'll moderate a question and response or answer session. So please, as Amy suggested, if you have any ideas or inquiries or questions, throw them into the chat. And then Amy will rejoin us at the end to conclude today's conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to Chris. Chris, it's all yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, Amy. It is a pleasure to be here. I always have a huge regard for the Plattsburgh program. You're best in the country at kind of keeping the Canada-US file, not just the narrow policy stuff that I do, but the broader sort of human-to-human connections, culture, and so much else to the fore. So I'm very glad to participate. Only wish I could be there with you in person, at least this time of year. If you invite me in February, I'll do it remotely again. I want to talk a little bit about the election, the thing that we all are talking about, or at least talking about furtively when we're with our friends, and what that means for Canada-US relationship. The relation. I titled this talk "The Signal and the Noise" because it's often used as a metaphor, trying to figure out what's the really important bit that is there, say when you're trying to tune into the radio or what have you, versus all the things that are around it that actually can kind of confuse the issue. And the signal for us is that there is in the Canada-US relationship a certain set of things that we can count on. They're elements that are predictable because they are repeated again and again. And I think one of the challenges of working in a world with a president like Donald Trump, but actually just the last couple of years in Washington, is that we've had lots of surprises, plot twists, as a friend of mine likes to say, that keep you glued to your TV set or to your phone to find out what's going on. And you couldn't, even if you were in Hollywood, come up with some of the plot twists that we just experienced and still sell your screenplay. They'd say you were doing science fiction. So separating out the two, the point here is just to give you a sense of what to look for. So obviously the election changes the occupant of the White House. That's still some weeks away. And I emphasize that because this transition period, which we've been through a lot, can be actually quite turbulent as different countries try to advance things before they lose a leader they know. President Biden is still the president, and there's still the ability to work on important files bilaterally. Then on January 20th, we'll inaugurate President Trump, and there'll be some drama there. We'll also have a count of the Electoral College vote, and I think most of us thought that was sort of a quiet, unimportant date until January 6th of 2021, when it became much more controversial. So we have that moment, which will come in between, but a couple of things that we know from this election. The vice president does the count as president of the Senate, and this time the vice president will be Kamala Harris, who was defeated in her run for the presidency. She's nonetheless said that she believes in the Constitution and the orderly transfer of power, and promised that she will conduct her constitutional duties as she's supposed to. So that should be lower drama, we're hoping. The inauguration should also be relatively violence-free, although going back to George W. Bush, the election in 2000, some of you will remember the hanging chads and the Supreme Court decision that finally decided how to count the votes properly. Since that time, we've had regular protests on inaugurations. Doesn't really seem to matter who the president is or what their party is. And some of it's just clowns trying to smash up a Starbucks or have a good time. But we should take that, I think, a little more seriously now, because the sort of violence, even if it's only theatrical, is still a scar on our democracy, and we don't like to see it. But I think you have to count that will happen. I put it in the noise category, not the signal category. Once the president's inaugurated, he needs to fill out his team. And those of you who are Canadian, you get to pick a cabinet out of the people who are elected. In theory, in the US, we can pick any president, anybody for a cabinet job that we want. But it's more than cabinet. It's ambassadors, it's a number of federal judge positions, and a number of officials who are from the deputy assistant secretary, deputy secretary, undersecretary levels within the federal bureaucracy who are political. The estimate's about 4,000 individuals who have to go through a process of Senate confirmation. Preparing for confirmation means you share your financial information. They look to see if there's any problem there. You may have seen in the newspapers this morning. What am I talking about? Most of you probably just looking on your phones anyway, but I'm old enough to say newspapers. But if you looked at your phone, you would have seen that that one of the people who had been proposed for Secretary of Treasury, Mr. Paulson, indicated that his finances were just too messy. He wouldn't be able to clean them up in time to take a federal post. And that does happen with wealthier people or people with complicated finances. And sometimes they only discover that when they go up for their hearing and they're rejected. But that process takes time. And if any of you have ever done a security clearance, you know the government wants to know everything you've ever done, every foreigner you've ever met. It's very similar. The Congress will ask for a lot of information before the Senate will hold a hearing on an individual. In recent years, that's taken longer and longer to get done, and sometimes taking as much as 18 months before you have all the positions filled in the government. And there's a rank order of priorities. Most of the cabinet members will get through. Sometimes we lose one. That's been a little bit the case lately, but not usually. Not always do you lose one, but you might lose one. Then you go to ambassadors and everything else. And the thing to remember about this is that the Senate has the ability to hold a nomination indefinitely. They don't have to act on it. And what you'll sometimes see is a member of the Senate taking a hostage. So they might, for example, put a freeze on the nominee to be ambassador to Canada because they're angry about softwood lumber, or they could actually be angry about the increase in the postage stamp rate. It doesn't have to have any connection to the individual. It's just one of those things that happens in our Senate. So it'll be very frustrating for the administration. And in the Canada-US relationship, it means there'll be a delay before we have someone who's potentially a delay, anyway, before somebody comes up to Ottawa to replace David Cohen, our current ambassador. Some ambassadors will stay until they're replaced. That's usually up to the White House. And we haven't heard one way or the other whether David Cohen's being asked to stay a little bit longer to carry us over into the new year. Otherwise, he'll probably stay till about the inauguration. He might leave a little bit earlier, but that's what we can expect. Congress is I think the sleeper issue in the election. Congress, all of the members of the House of Representatives and a third of the members of the Senate were up. And what we saw, if you remember from 2022, the Republicans took control of a very slim majority in the House of Representatives. And as a result, the leader of the Democrats became the minority leader in the House Minority Leader. That person would have been Nancy Pelosi because she had been Speaker before, but Representative Pelosi decided that she didn't want to be minority leader, and she's certainly earned that right because she's been in the House for a very long time. So she left the field for a successor, and Hakeem Jeffries of New York was chosen as the House Minority Leader. Then over the last year, you saw some very not only close votes, but votes that actually failed for things like Ukraine support and military assistance. Some people chose to interpret that as a sign that Republicans don't care about the war in Ukraine, or they have a position that is sort of against what the administration had proposed in terms of assistance. For the most part, however, I think what you saw, the real reason why we had those failed votes, is that Mike Johnson, now who was the Speaker of the House prior to the election, still is at the moment, was a rookie. Had been in the House for a long time, but being in the House is different than running the House. And you have to learn which representatives you deal with will lie to your face and say, yes, I'll vote for you, and then vote the other way. Which ones respond to threats? Which one responds to carrots? How do you build those coalitions? And it's very hard. It's a very hard process, even if you've been in the chamber, kind of learning that whole process for all the 434 other members of the House. Secondly, and this is where I think it bears on our current situation, we're seeing a change in the Senate, because in the 2024 election, Mitch McConnell, who will remain in the Senate, announced he was going to give up his leadership as Senate Majority Leader or Minority Leader prior to the election, and now it'll be a Majority Leader. And today the Senate elected John Thune to be the head of the Senate Majority Leader. It's that position that manages all of the nominations and confirmations to come. And so, although John Thune has been in the Senate for a while, for sure, he knows the chamber, he too will have to figure out how can he use a combination of carrots and sticks to run the chamber. For our Canadian friends, that's a bit shocking because party discipline exists in Canada, even in the Senate, where there are these independent senators who used to be Liberals. But in the United States, almost every representative, every person for elected office raises their own money. And because they can raise their own money and their incumbency within their district gives them a lot of support, they really don't need the leadership as much as, say, a member of parliament needs the leadership of their party to kind of continue in the game. So that means that Congress has been quite will be quite unpredictable, and we may see some bumps on the road as the new administration takes shape, even though the control of the House and the Senate now looks like it will be in the same party hands as the presidency. That doesn't guarantee they all get along. Big tent parties. If I can, I want to also talk a little bit about the civil service. We put great stock in the civil service because they're the ones who aren't elected. They stay from year election to election. They carry on in files. We're in an interesting position with the civil service today, partly because the civil service has been worked very, very hard in recent years and has felt relatively unsupported. The Heritage Foundation, another think tank here in Washington, has had something called Project 2025, trying to identify members of the civil service who might be more political and who should be pushed out of work. And now the president has asked Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy to put together a government efficiency office, which they hope will help slim down the size of the federal civil service and make it more efficient. I've only seen in my time in Washington one moment where we actually reduced the size of the federal workforce, and that was during the Clinton administration. And it happened because the World War II generation retired. They just finally aged out. We're on the cusp of something similar now, which I think combined with some of these efforts to make the government smaller and more efficient will have a big impact. And that is the retirement of the last of the baby boom generation. Some of them will retire because they've hit that time in their careers. Others will retire because they don't feel supported or they don't like the political outlook that's coming in the next few years. When they resign, that's fine, but it does put a big pressure on our Canada-US relationship. Throughout the government, there are people who've worked the Canada-US files in the EPA, in the Department of Transportation, in DHS for a long amount of time. And because they've stayed with those files, even if they didn't know Canada well when they started, they came to know Canada better over time. Unfortunately, our federal government is really bad about knowledge management and institutional learning. And so when people retire, we're going to hire some nice millennials, Generation Z officials, and they will have to start from scratch with barely notes that they can look at to figure out how to get started. Well, that's not a bad thing. I mean, fresh slate, I guess. It still will mean that it'll take longer to pursue certain files. And the Canadians that I talk to are already frustrated that the US has become so transactional that there's no grand strategy. There just tends to be one issue after the other that we have to argue about. And it can be frustrating working with the US for that reason. However, we have an agenda. That's my second point of some reassurance, I hope. There's a built-in agenda for Canada-US relations. The catchphrase we have for it now is the roadmap for a renewed US-Canada partnership, which was established by President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau in February of 2021 in what was billed as the president's first virtual bilateral. He'd had other meetings with other leaders, but this is the first time he did a bilateral. Anyway, they came up with an agenda. The roadmap has 6 broad areas with a number of action items under each. And from its initiation to today, officials have been working in those categories and reporting directly to our ambassador in Washington and Canada's ambassador here. Oh, no, our ambassador in Ottawa, Canada's ambassador here in Washington. And they have shepherded the process, trying to make sure things keep moving. That agenda will continue, probably with a slightly different emphasis and probably with a new name. I don't know what they'll call it, but administrations always like to put their own stamp on things. So maybe we'll call it Making Canada-US Relations Great Again. And we'll have a different name, but don't worry about different names. That doesn't really matter, but that agenda needs some follow through. Second, we have a North American Leaders Summit agenda. This is Canada, US, and Mexico. The leaders put together an agenda, the first big agenda when they met in, I think it was March of 2021. President Biden held the first session. Then they had a meeting that was supposed to be in 2022, couldn't get scheduled until 2023 in January. And that was a Mexico hosted meeting that continued to report on the agenda. There were a couple of big items on that agenda. and now Canada is due to host, but was unable to find time in late 2003, anytime in 2004, and now it looks like the summit may slip to 2025. The reason I mention that is there is a small chance that we'll be surprised to hear that President Biden is going to go to Canada for a North American Leaders Summit during this period of his lame duck time. The reason for doing that would be to clear the slate on the North American agenda so that the next summit, which the US will host, would tee up the USMCA review process, which is one that we're all worried about coming up in 2026. When I say worry, that's my next item on the agenda. It's the USMCA's review. The review had to be held 6 years after the agreement took effect. So here we are, it'll be in 2026. The implementing legislation for the USMCA includes language Congress put in that asks the administration no later than 6 months before the start of the review to provide answers to two questions. One, is the administration looking to withdraw from the USMCA? And secondly, do they want to renegotiate any of its terms? If they wish to withdraw, that's fine. They can do that. If they wish to renegotiate, they need a separate grant of trade promotion authority to the White House to be able to negotiate a new agreement. Going into this year, I was fairly optimistic that the review would not lead to withdrawal, in part because the agreement was so popular in Congress. It had deeper bipartisan support, by which I mean more Republicans and Democrats voting in favor of implementation of USMCA than voted for the WTO round of the Uruguay round WTO agreement, NAFTA, or even Canada's free trade. So it is a broad bipartisan supported agreement. And I didn't see the Trump administration, were to come back, were President Trump to win, walking away from something that was one of his signal achievements during his time in office. On the other hand, there was some question about Kamala Harris because as senator, she voted against the USMCA. She was a USMCA skeptic, thought it needed stronger labor protections and so forth. Well, now that we have an outcome, I still don't think that the Trump administration has an intention to withdraw. However, the word here in Washington seems to be that they would like to reopen the agreement and make some changes. So we'll find out at least we'll find out if they want to do that sometime around June or July, sometime over the summer, which will signal where we're headed. And it's and if we're going to renegotiate, then there'll be a request for trade promotion authority legislation that then has to get passed. So that would probably put us in a position to start renegotiation late next year, and then we could start sometime in 2026 to meet the requirement of that change. And we could talk about what might change if you'd like there. Now, there are always some crises that pop up, but to give you one last thing that I think we can look forward to that is a little more positive, and that is hosting the World Cup in 2026. This is something a lot of people are looking forward to. It's also unprecedented that 3 countries would host together a major sporting event of this sort. And although the Olympics draw a lot of people, the Olympics are, if any of you have gone, I know most of you don't go back to the Lake Placid days, but they're expensive. It's hard to get tickets. Tickets are pricey. The cities are usually very expensive. The hotel rates go up. The flight costs go up. Soccer, World Cup soccer has been always a little bit different. It attracts more fans. There are fans who can't get tickets to go to the actual game, but tailgate or hang out around the arena. We're expecting a lot of people to come from around the world for this event. It is a big event. Even soccer is becoming bigger and bigger in the US and Canada as well. But I think that'll be a big marker for the leaders to get to know each other. Finally, just a word on some of the opportunities that I think we have there. There are some traditions and predictable schedule items coming up. In the next couple of weeks, we'll see Peru host the Association Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Association. Both Canada and the United States are members. And that's in Lima, Peru. And then following that will be the G20, which meets in Rio de Janeiro, which will be a meeting. Both of those meetings will have President Biden participating, which is positive. But they'll all be thinking about what comes next under Donald Trump. And it'll be a good opportunity for Prime Minister Trudeau to talk to fellow world leaders. Many people around the world think the Canadians kind of understand the Americans better than other people, just because they're so close. I don't know whether Justin Trudeau will necessarily feel that confident, but he may share his insights. Typically, we see a president make their first international trip to Canada Donald Trump in his first administration chose not to do that, and I don't think he'll make Canada his top priority this year either. So we shouldn't worry too much about that. Even President Biden, despite the virtual bilateral, it took him until early 2023 to find time to come up to Canada. President Trump won't wait that long. It looks like his first opportunity to visit Canada, which was his first visit physically to Canada in the first Trump administration, will be provided by the G7. And Canada hosts the G7 in June in Kananaskis in Alberta. That should be a meeting where President Trump is there. I know we're thinking a Canadian election might occur, so we don't know whether we'll have Prime Minister Trudeau or someone else hosting, but the work has already started to try to get those meetings going. And what's interesting about the G7 is that there are ministerial meetings held all year long between finance ministers, environment ministers, and they're held separately, but in the same host country. The schedule for those meetings is being held up, trying to figure out how long it will take for the administration to have a cabinet in place, because nobody wants to go ahead without the Americans, and we need to know who's in charge of the various departments so that they get the invitation. So there'll be a bit of a delay. I think we're going to back end load a lot of the ministerial meetings after the Leaders Summit, just because of the schedule. But we'll see how that goes. But that's an important level. Not all cooperation has to go through the president. A lot of it happens at the departmental level. So those relationships will be very important. And then worth noting also, there'll be a NATO summit at the end of June in the Netherlands. Canada will go. Canada's now at the last two NATO summits in Washington and before that in Vilnius, Lithuania, repeated the pledge that Stephen Harper made in Wales at the Wales summit back in 2011, which is a commitment to 2% of GDP spending on defense. This is something that just in the last, say, 4 or 5 years has gone from being something most Canadians didn't really think was important to something that the polling shows now more Canadians do think is important. The question is how to get there, and what we've seen are 3 pledges and not much delivery yet. So I think there'll be pressure on Canada going into that summit to have an actual plan to reach its 2%, not just a pledge. The Prime Minister in Washington said he would hope to get there by 2032. So, okay, that's not that long from now. So what's the plan and how will it take shape? I think there'll be a lot of questions about that. That'll get us to about the middle of next year, which is about when we'll probably hear about a USMCA review and everything will be well underway. That's about as far as I want to predict, but I know all of those things will happen. And as crazy as the personalities and the issues can sometimes be, the signal here that is the thread that holds all this together are our institutions. And when you don't know what the personalities will do, you take a look at these institutional built-in agendas, built-in rules, and they tell you a lot about what will happen and what probably will not happen in the year ahead. So I'm optimistic. I think we can make this work, but I'd be open to questions from Chris, anybody. I'm open.
Thank you, Chris, very, very much for your overarching remarks. Wonderful. And we do have a range of inquiries and questions from comments from individuals on a variety of files that are central to the Canada-US relationship. One of which is sort of a big picture question, has to do with individuals, and that is, very well as a scholar that, certain folks who look at the Canada-US relationship often have a tendency to put a disproportionate amount of impact on who the leaders are, right? So we know from President-elect Trump's first time in office that he didn't necessarily have a warm and fuzzy relationship with the current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. And we also know that Mr. Trudeau, unless something miraculously happens and the Liberal Party are going to be ushered out of office in a very large scale way, I think there's no way to deny that. And if, in fact, the Conservative government move forward and Mr. Poilievre becomes the Prime Minister, one question is, should we expect to see a warmer relationship between Canada and the US? And somebody pointed out too that, well, look, when Trump was president the first time around, there was a very conservative government or governments, if you will, in the UK, and that didn't seem to make a smidge of difference. So what's your thoughts on that, Chris?
Well, first I agree with your opening comment, which is that we overemphasize the personal relationship between the president and the prime minister. It's natural, it's a human story, and you can kind of see that. And it's very relatable for people who have their own friends and frenemies in life. So I understand why we do it, but we do tend to over-exaggerate it. I guess you can't over-exaggerate, we just exaggerate its importance. The challenge, though, is that it's often the personal relationship between the president and the prime minister that we call on when there's a crisis to kind of calm things down or order people to sort of step back and let's see what we can do to work things out. That's absolutely been the case with things like Canada's wildfires, where it was sort of a presidential call up to Canada saying, what can we do? What can we do to help? You know, we've got some capabilities, we'll put them at your disposal. So that's the moment where you really want to see that leadership. And it doesn't seem as though the president will have a great relationship with Justin Trudeau. I want to be fair, though. I mean, Justin Trudeau spent a lot of time comparing Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives to the Donald Trump movement. There was talk about the Freedom Truckers being a version of the insurrection on January 6th. The problem that I think every politician has to contend with now is that there's nothing you say stops there, especially when you broadcast it or put it on social media, it gets to everywhere. And so President Trump, I think like many politicians, has a ego, and having all of that thrown in, sort of trying to tar Canada's opposition by association with his movement, his ideas, will not endear Justin Trudeau to Donald Trump, to put it mildly. The implication of the other question, though, I think is an interesting one. Does that mean that if Prime Minister Pierre Poilievre picks up the phone, will he have a better relationship with Donald Trump? And I don't know that that's guaranteed. He'll have a first start. And my dad likes to say you never get a second chance to make a first impression. That's Trudeau's problem. But Pierre Poilievre will have a first opportunity to sort of set a tone for the relationship. Trump has often responded to those kind of overtures, especially after a leader he hasn't liked as much, with at least some warmth, some positivity. And you saw that even Sir Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, a Labour Prime Minister, so not the same sort of side of the political spectrum as Donald Trump, made the point of coming over to meet with Donald Trump. And they had a relatively constructive meeting. So it can work. It doesn't. But I think what as scholars will all be talking about is how close is a Canadian Conservative of Pierre Poilievre's stripe to a Donald Trump Republican. And Donald Trump definitely has a set of ideas that are coherent, that he follows, about a little bit of populism, some economic nationalism, and so on and so forth. They are not necessarily the same ideas that Pierre Poilievre brings in. So I don't think we should equate the two or say, well, they're both on the right, so they'll naturally get along. They often don't. And I think one of the big challenges is that Pierre Poilievre has been very clear, with remarkable message discipline, that he wants to cut taxes and shrink some aspects of the government. How does that work with getting to 2% of GDP by defense? So there could be some sticky issues that come up, but I think overall the fact that we have a reboot will be welcome. I won't say a reset button. We tried that with Russia; it didn't work. So just a reboot.
Thanks, Chris. We've had, as you know, Mr. Trump, President-elect Trump, has suggested that he's going to pursue a policy of mass deportation of illegals in the United States. And as you know, in the last week or so, maybe 10 days, a number of commentators have begun to focus on what that potentially could mean for Canada, and what it means for folks wanting to go north. And we don't know how many that might be, but it's raising, and it's been well covered in the Canadian media. There's a security issue not only for folks who might leave the United States going north, but there's also, as I say, a focus on how safe. Elise Stefanik, recently nominated for permanent representative to the United Nations for the United States, has repeatedly, although a very strong promoter of the Canada-US relationship, has been critical of Canada's efforts in terms of, having a strong and secure border and preventing illegals crossing from Canada to the United States. What's your sense on the possibility of how this might strain the Canada-US relationship?
Well, I'd separate it into two periods. One, the time before Donald Trump is inaugurated, and the other, what happens after. The reason I say that is some of your viewers will remember that When Donald Trump was elected and prior to his inauguration in 2016, he had a similar message on deportation and building the wall and taking a tough line on migration. And that led many migrants who were in the United States to self-deport, to use that phrase, trying to get to Canada to get out ahead of being thrown out of the United States, partly because they didn't want to necessarily acquire an arrest record in the US, what have you, but they chose to take that risk themselves. The Biden administration can do some things to help collaborate with Canada to make sure that flow isn't too unmanageable, but it will be tricky because it will be anticipating what Donald Trump may or may not do. And so it will be difficult for Donald Trump to then take any sort of role to help work with us out with Canada. After Donald Trump comes in, he will face a problem that Canada faces as well. We all do, which is that according to the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, there is an estimated 120 million stateless and displaced people around the world. And those are people who are fleeing civil war in Sudan, Ukraine, Syria, Venezuela, Haiti. It's an unfortunately very long list of places that people are trying to get out of and are desperate enough to risk their lives to do. Now, there are a handful of countries that are usually the target of migrants because they have enough of economic success that people might be able to find jobs and maybe some assistance. So that includes the countries of Europe, Britain in particular, Canada, Australia, United States. It's really a short list. So that's 120 million people looking for a place to land, and that puts a lot of pressure on our systems. Canadians, for a long time, have been proud of a very positive attitude towards immigrants, and I sometimes find it annoying when they kind of look down their nose at Americans as if we all hate immigrants. We're a country of immigrants too. But I think what really frustrates a lot of citizens is the sense that there's no control at the border and that people are coming in and they're just all over the place. And for people with maybe a bit of a religious background, I think their concern is that when you bring in people who are refugees who come in often with nothing, they aren't like the traditional Canadian immigrants who come in with a college degree and will have an easy path assimilating into the middle class. These are people who need a lot of help. They may need language help. They may need help getting their kids to school. Their level of health may be poor, and they'll need some remedial help to bring themselves back up to full health. That's a real challenge. And for the government to allow their entry, even if it is by doing nothing when they try to cross illegally, and then not have a plan to take care of those people, it's hard. The Canadian debate increasingly has moved closer to the US debate with concern about the impact of large numbers of inbound migrants and Canada's housing crisis, or the pressure that's on the Canadian healthcare system, which is already struggling to keep up with its costs and so on. I don't think there are any Canadians, really, or not very many Americans either, who want to punish the people who are in the situation, but our systems are going to be under a lot of pressure. And it's really important, I think, for the US and Canada to cooperate on this, trying to identify individuals, make sure we know who we're letting in, have done the right background checks, even encouraging legal application for refugee status or what have you. One of the big issues of last year was the Safe Third Country Agreement. And some of your viewers will know that the Supreme Court of Canada didn't invalidate the Safe Third Country Agreement because the US wasn't safe, but they challenged the Canadian government for declaring the US a safe third country without having any process to determine whether it was or wasn't safe. Kind of a response to activists who said, well, if Donald Trump's there, you should ask that question. Well, that has been resolved, but we still have problems with the RCMP in Canada not having the resources to do the full work of a border patrol, which they have. We have a separate border patrol, and we're in a bit better shape. But there's so many areas where we could cooperate. So I think migration is going to be on our national political agendas, but also on the bilateral agenda for quite some time. The numbers suggest that it will be, and I can't see us closing our doors completely, but if we cooperate, maybe we can cope better together.
Sure. So. Thank you. I know our audience would very much appreciate the opportunity to hear from you on the following, and that is, when Donald Trump was first elected as president and came into office, the government of Canada under Justin Trudeau had a cabinet committee on Canada-US relations, and they put in place, as you know firsthand, this sort of Team Canada approach in the United States, which was effectively trying to go to everywhere but the local corner store to convince individuals, but let's to sound a little bit more scholarly elected officials, if you will, at a state level in terms of governor's offices, at regional organizations, and of course, Congress and beyond, and Mr. President Trump's cabinet members and his advisors, that it was in the interest of the United States to have a robust relationship with Canada. From everything we know this time around, Mr. Trudeau has recently revived the cabinet committee, asking Deputy Prime Minister Freeland to take charge of that. And Canada has once again been silently, or somewhat, since January, so pursuing this Team Canada approach. The reason I bring this up is I've had a conversation recently with some folks in the know who suggested this is very wrong-headed this time, that it's very mistaken, because the number of individuals that were available to speak with, that especially in terms of Trump's inner sanctum, that you could get to and that were willing and able to listen to a conversation along those lines have shrunk considerably. Because we're now talking about loyalists, we're talking about Trumpists, and some would even say, in fact, it was pointed out in the Globe and Mail this morning, that if you take a look at who Mr. Trump has picked for certain positions in his administration, these are people who are not exactly friendly toward Canada, or less friendly, let's say, or less open to listening. So has this Team Canada idea, is it misplaced, or is it just harder to succeed under the current circumstances?
Well, that's a very good question. And I'll draw a quick distinction, because the initial Team Canada effort, first, it started with a blank slate. So Canada was just reintroducing itself. Second, it was driven by data. Canada had done a huge amount of work to be able to identify just how much trade, investment, job creation could be tied to Canada for every zip code in the US. They could tell any member of Congress, any governor, any senator exactly how important Canada was. And the message was fairly soft. It was, we're from Canada and we're more important to you than you realize. And the facts were there, the numbers were there. I think it had a huge impact, particularly on Capitol Hill, but also among governors who were surprised by the data. We could argue whether they should have been, and whether there should be a way to tap that kind of data without Canada doing it for us, but that was the positive effect. And I think it really helped Canada in the USMCA negotiations, when at different times it seemed as though Mexico had more to offer in terms of opening up its economy than Canada did, because Canada had had an open economy for a long time. More recently, as this election campaign has gone on, there's been a second wave of Team Canada, and this one's been very different. Unlike the first, which was data-driven and was also all-party, included the NDP, included the Bloc, included premiers from across the country, the most recent iteration of Team Canada has been more narrowly confined to members of the Trudeau cabinet inner circle, and of course Ambassador Hillman here. There's been less participation by premiers. There's been less participation by opposition leaders, and that may be their choice. So I'll leave that open to interpretation. But it's been, as a result, less persuasive here. Because it seemed much more like a defense of Canada, or a demonstration that the Trudeau government could handle a Donald Trump if it had to. I don't think it's been as successful, because the message hasn't been as universal and it hasn't been as coming from as many places. That said, I do think that the message itself and the idea of Team Canada outreach is an important one, because it goes beyond the personalities and talks about why we have to get along. Here are the facts. Facts still matter. And this is a terrible metaphor, I'll probably get sued for using a trade name. But if you think of the relationship like a Velcro strip, there are all those little hooks and all those little fuzzy things. That's what we deal with all the time. And you can have personalities that sort of pull apart a little bit, but there's the other parts of that strip are still holding on tight. The relationship isn't just the president, the prime minister, or even cabinet counterparts. It's people to people relations. And so as much as you might peel away bits of it, it takes a lot to pull the whole thing apart. And this is really useful now. I think you've seen some comments in the last couple of days from Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, talking about ways that maybe you could do some bilateral engagement on issues that Mexico might not want to talk about, particularly things like EVs and Chinese investment in North America. Premier Ford is a good spokesperson for Canada when it comes to dealing with the Trump administration. He is also a populist. He's very much a patriotic Canadian. He doesn't, he's not going to slag the country or anything, but he will at the same time be more relatable for many people inside the new Trudeau government. So you have so many Canadians, many of whom will really click well down here. You just have to make sure that you can change up the character. And I'll just share with you one of my crazy ideas, and this comes only from myself, so you've heard it here first. I think Canada should be creative, and if there is a change in government in Canada, send an ambassador down who might be a bit of a game changer themselves. I think we've tended to appoint people who are close to the prime minister, et cetera. Sometimes a little bit of a politician, somebody like Frank McKenna, who was ambassador for a while, that sort of thing. But I think if Pierre Poilievre asked me, I think he should name Wayne Gretzky as his ambassador to Canada and to the United States. And why do I say that? Well, he seems to vote conservative, but more importantly, the job of the ambassador and the work the embassy does is absolutely unparalleled in terms of working on Capitol Hill. And even if the prime minister doesn't have the best relationship with conservative Republicans, Canada doesn't have a door closed to it anywhere on the Hill. They talk to people. They may not always agree, but I don't think the ambassador spends any day of the working week where she's not at one time or another working on Capitol Hill or working with people in their districts. It's a very impressive operation. I think countries around the world kind of look with envy at what Canada's been able to pull off, and it's very impressive. So there are pieces of that Velcro that are still sticking, but my sort of fantasy of Gretzky as ambassador is sort of built on that. There's not a congressman who wouldn't take that call or take that meeting to meet the great one. And yes, it's celebrity, almost stunt casting, but we're Americans. We love that kind of stuff. So I think it could be good. Anyway, my dumb idea. If it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. But if it happens, you heard it here first.
It's not a dumb idea. It's novel, and I think there's a lot of merit to it, because if only Wayne Gretzky, who is a conservative, also is an avid golfer, and his son-in-law, of course, Dustin Johnson, is a professional golfer, and I think it's his favorite pastime. So if there's not a way that he couldn't be on the golf course with the president-elect who likes to golf, as we know, he would be. So, over at his course in Virginia. So why not? Why not consider it? Because you're right. Wayne Gretzky's name opens doors. Let's be honest about that. So I'm going to try, Chris, if I might, just to weave together a few things that have come in that are all sort of trade related. We know during President-elect Trump's first term in office that there were questions and movements and applications of tariffs toward Canada on metal products. And most economists who have been polled recently suggest that's one of the top 2 or 3 items that are on the list of potential 10% tariffs, if not more, should that go forward. We're still waiting to hear, at least before we came on, I haven't heard who the new U.S. trade representative is going to be. And I think people are very much interested to see if it'll be Robert Lighthizer again. And given his particular strengths and preferences when it comes to tariffs, that could be a very interesting engagement with Canada. And with regard to the USMCA being not abandoned but renegotiated, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that one of the continuing points of irritation for the United States is that Canada continues to fail to open its milk or dairy supply chain, supply management regime. It's a decidedly protectionist approach, and they're really, really unwilling to engage in sort of what we might call free trade on that. So there's all these sort of, and I'm sorry, there's not necessarily a straightforward question in there, but thinking ahead, do you think that I certainly don't, I don't think that Trump would hesitate if he felt like he wanted to move in a more protectionist direction vis-a-vis Canada.
It's a very complicated question, and so I'll answer it with a couple of observations. The first is, in the first Trump administration, we heard from the president almost from the inauguration on that he would tear up NAFTA if Canada and Mexico didn't come to the table to renegotiate it and fix it. Now, the headline was Trump threatens to tear up NAFTA, which by the time he was making those comments was popular in Canada, was popular in Mexico. They saw the benefits, but was still controversial in the United States. Canadians had heard that rhetoric before, but they hadn't necessarily expected the U.S. to tear up the agreement. So it was definitely a headline grabber. But what the president did was use that to signal his toughness to his own voters, but also to get Canada and Mexico to come to the table. And of course, they came to the table. You'd have to. So I think the 10% threat, because he's threatened it on all imports, is really to get people to take him seriously and to come to the table and figure out what they can do to avoid being subject to that kind of cross-the-board tariff. Within the Canada-US relationship, there are different levels of vulnerability. A lot of Canada's exports are one way. They come into the US, and so they could be subject to the tariff. You think about energy, you think about a lot of commodities, even softwood lumber for that matter, any number of products that just cross the border once. But in New York and in much of the Midwest, we have an integrated manufacturing base. And so goods will actually cross the border multiple times in their production. And this is one area where we would be foolish to put a 10% tariff on, I think, because if you did, unless you had like a GST rebate that was easy for business to use, you would be just accelerating this climb in the price of the product, both the price of production and the price for the consumer. And I don't think Donald Trump ran for president indifferent to the concerns of people in the Midwest who are trying to make ends meet and already think inflation is biting too high. So they're not going to want to hear that everything from Procter & Gamble soap to their next car will be more expensive because of Trump tariffs. So I think the likelihood of a broad application across all areas is unlikely. I think instead it'll be a more targeted one. Now, I don't expect many of your viewers have purchased Robert Lighthizer book, but I have. People pay me to keep tabs on this stuff. And his book is called No Trade is Free. And if you look at the book, 3/4 of it is about China. Canada comes up for sure, but it's mostly about the threat of opening up to China, the mistake of letting them into the WTO, the predatory practices of the Chinese. Now, that's something that many people will debate, but it is something on which Canada and the United States are quite aligned at the moment. We agree that China has played dirty on trade. And so to the extent that Canada and the US are able to align on pushback against China, then I think actually the likelihood of a 10% tariff goes down, because we'll essentially be working together on what is clearly Robert Lighthizer's top priority. And I've heard the same rumors that he might be returning to USTR, and he would bring this sort of agenda with him, I think. So I'm somewhat optimistic. Now on dairy, I don't know. I mean, New Yorkers will know. We don't have supply management, but we have subsidies. Everybody wants to be able to have milk, and they want to have milk that's healthy and nearby. And so we both have different systems to keep that going. The difference is that a subsidy tends to lead to more production, whereas supply management deliberately constrains supply and pushes up prices. You can debate the merits of the two systems, but I think it will be difficult for us to manage this until Canada figures out a way to move away from supply management, maybe by turning it into a tariff, maybe by saying that quotas will expire when the current quota owner passes away, that you can't pass it from generation to generation. There are different ways to do it. The most brutal, those of you who remember the shutdown of the cod fishery, where fishermen in Atlantic Canada were just told, that's it, you can't fish anymore, and were given a sort of income support, but that was it. So you could see any range of things happening, but as long as it's there, I think it will be a pressure point. But remember that Pierre Poilievre was able to win the Conservative leadership shortly after Andrew Scheer threatened to get rid of supply management and found that all the supply management dairy people voted for his opponents. This was something that Maxime Bernier experienced as well. So there's a certain political clout, and I think it's unlikely we're going to see this kind of major transformation under a Conservative government. So what do? I think what we'll see is some sort of targeted carve-outs. A couple of years ago, Nestle, which has a plant in Ontario, said that we need access to lower cost milk to make milk chocolate. And if we can't get it, we'll move our plant to the US. That's just that. And so the decision was made not to change supply management, but to create a sort of special waiver to allow milk to come in from the US at a lower price so that it could be supplied. So you can do deals like that to keep the pressure to a more moderated level. But whereas Bill C-82, which I think has come now through the Senate, is moving its way through Parliament, would say Canada can never negotiate on dairy supply management. I think that is a mistake. Canada's a small open economy, doesn't have a lot to trade with. So taking that off the table at the outset, I think would would give Canada little to bring to a USMCA review if it wanted to get more access to something. I'm not saying that Canada should sell out the dairy industry, but I think that artificial constraints on the negotiators' ability to look for trade-offs puts Canada in a weaker position. And you only have to look at softwood lumber to see why. Softwood lumber has been difficult to resolve because we've always kept it out. Brian Mulroney decided not to put it in the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. It's never been in. So we can only resolve softwood lumber by itself. You can't say, well, we'll give Canada concession on autos because we're going to let them do what they want on wood. There's just no easy trade-offs. And I think that limits what negotiators can do, even good negotiators going into a major negotiation.
I think you're precisely correct. Ken and Julie Holland have offered a chapter in a book that Frederic Gagnon, Stéphane Paquin, and I are producing that'll come out in January with Palgrave Macmillan Press on the Quebec-US relationship. And they've looked at this question of dairy supply management in the province of Quebec, and they offer a really sharp, brilliant critique of how that process hasn't benefited Canada or let alone Quebec. So it's fascinating to look at. I'm going to return, Chris, if I can, to, and there's no answer to this question either. We've talked about Canada's so-called 2% commitment to GDP, to defense spending, NATO spending, which Mr. Trump was, some might say, really focused on during his first term as president, and will remain likely focused on. Joe Jockle at a conference last week said that Canada is effectively spending about 1.37% of its GDP. And what Canada under Trudeau has decided to do over the past few years is when the criticism arises, particularly from the United States, about, oh, you're not doing what you need to do, the idea is not to sort of focus on the actual percentage, but to instead show what they're doing by way of leadership, whether it's the battle group battalion over in Latvia, whether it's various more prominent leadership roles that Canada has taken. This won't go away, that's for sure. And there is no necessarily easy solution. I think in this discussion with Joe Jockle and others last week in Massachusetts, the point was raised, and I think it's a very valid point, that, Canada has, since the 1945, frankly, it found itself in this Cold War bipolar world, at least through 1991. And it's been able to be, in the phrase of Mancur Olson and others, it's been able to be a free rider. It hasn't had to prioritize. It hasn't had to invest because they know they've been a consumer of security, right? And they know at the end of the day that if something, God forsaken, happens, that the United States will, quote unquote, come in. So it's hard to see what necessarily will shift. The question is, Chris, I guess, to see what makes Canada move quicker toward that 2% number.
Well, take this in bits. First, the pressure. Second, maybe how Canada responds. And third, what the upside of this situation is. So I'll start with the pressure. What we saw in the last year, and this was before Donald Trump was expected to take any future role, was a kind of clash with Canada caught in between Europeans and Americans on this question. The Europeans resented the fact that they had to make painful budget cuts of things that are popular in order to spend more money on their own defense. They did so because they're close to Russia and they saw the destabilizing effect and the risks that they were facing. Certainly, if you're a frontline state, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, you feel it very viscerally. And our new NATO allies in Finland, Norway, both of which are right on the frontier, can feel it as well. So that's part of it. But the other part of it is they've made those sacrifices under pressure from the United States, which has been talking about reaching 2% for some time. But in the eyes of the Europeans, we, the United States, were letting Canada get away with nothing. And there was sort of unfair comparisons to the Canada being the teacher's pet, or sort of the spoiled brat of NATO. I know brat's supposed to be cool now. I can't keep up on the lingo, but anyway, spoiled for sure, in that they didn't ever have to pony up the money. At the same time, here in Washington, the Senate Armed Services Committee did a comprehensive review and came to the conclusion that what we currently spend, and in the last year, we committed $880 billion to defense, to the defense budget, is inadequate. And that with a non-zero risk of great power conflict, an actual war in the next decade, it was important for the US to move its spending closer to $1.2 trillion a year. That's a lot of money. And especially if we don't raise taxes substantially, the only way we can reach that is by making cuts to popular programs. And so you have a number of members of Congress who feel very concerned that a country like Canada, which is blessed with wealth and prosperity, expects the US to protect it for free and isn't willing to make that step. I think that's what made the pressure so severe, because every president since Eisenhower's asked Canada to spend more money on defense. And so that's not a new song from Trump or anybody else. But I think the frustration has reached a peak. And so it puts a lot of pressure on Canada. So second, then what do we do about it? Well, Canada's rightly said that the way that NATO's formula works, Canada only gets credit for spending when it spends the money, not when it commits the money. And so famously, Canada's purchased 88 F-35 fighter aircraft. Those are a substantial cost. They cost some billions. And Canada's waiting for delivery. It will only count as spending when it takes delivery and it makes that check go out. But what's happening now is that Canadian allies, American allies too, in places like South Korea, Japan, Israel, are asking for early delivery because they're right up against some threat, and they're willing to pay a premium to get to the head of the queue. Very much a capitalist approach. We'll pay a premium for early delivery, but the problem is that pushes Canada's delivery further and further into the distance. So how do you make up that figure? I think Canada's defense policy update and the focus on the Arctic, which allows much more spending in a domestic sphere, could be the answer. It certainly makes the spending more beneficial to Canadians. Another answer comes from something that the Biden administration did, which I think has been tremendously valuable, which is a redefinition of the defense industrial base of the United States as the defense industrial base of the US plus its allies. Canada is well positioned because of the 1956 Defense Production Sharing Agreement within defense supply chains, and there will be a significant increase in defense orders because most of the countries of Europe, the United States, we've been sending weapons out of our arsenals to go help the Ukrainians and others. So we need to replenish stocks. We need to build up stockpiles, and that's going to lead to a lot of business. If you go back 10, 20 years, Canadians were always reluctant to commit to new purchases because they wanted industrial benefits on the side. Like, if we're going to spend this money, what do we get back? Well, there's no question Canada can have quite a bit of defense production secondary benefits. So it's all about packaging what Canada's investment is from the government side in a way that shows progress. I don't think it has to be 2% tomorrow, but there has to be an actual plan. And this is where I'm somewhat critical that after Stephen Harper and then Justin Trudeau twice made this commitment to get to 2%, we still don't have a concrete plan for how we get to that. And I think it's only reasonable for the US to ask Canada to actually spell out, what's the strategy and will you get there? Lastly, I think this is a huge opportunity because of some new things coming from that defense industrial base rethink. Something like ICE Pact, which is the agreement to develop icebreakers jointly between Canada, the US, and Finland. There's another agreement, I don't think it has a catchy name, that is between Norway, Germany, and Canada to build non-nuclear Arctic-capable submarines that they would design together, build together, and then each buy a certain number of. AUKUS, which people talk about, the Australia, UK, US agreement regarding submarines as well. For which many Canadians were sort of surprised and a little offended they didn't get invited into in the first place, is another example of a multilateral consortium to develop a system and put it into the field. There's a lot of areas where I think Canada could take the lead, particularly in Arctic space, driving technology forward. And I'll put in a little special plug. Some of your listeners may know that in 1961, the US and Canada signed a defense research and development agreement that permitted, created a pool of money that both the US and Canadian governments put their money into that could be used to fund research and development around military activity. When Paul Martin was finance minister in the early Chrétien governments, he chose to zero out Canada's contribution in order to save money. Maybe made sense, but that vehicle, that option hasn't disappeared. And now that R&D can include things like software, drones, AI, cyber, there's a lot of Canadian talent in those areas. So it would make sense and maybe be a positive gesture for a future government to put money back into that pot and use it to collaborate on real cutting edge technology that could help advance our security going forward.
Chris, I've got one last observation for you / inquiry, and then I'll turn it back over to Amy. There's a suggestion that the Canada-US relationship, at least next year, that from the Canadian perspective, that a lot of what's going to drive it won't be political forces, but economic forces. So, for example, you pick up today's Financial Times or the London Times or the Wall Street Journal, and there's a variety of economists and policy experts suggesting that there's a strong likelihood, based surely on supply and demand, that prices for Brent or West Intermediate Texas crude next year might hit $40 a barrel from its current level, maybe even 30. And there are suggestions, of course, with regard to the value of the Canadian dollar vis-a-vis the United States dollar, that with a little bit of persistent inflation in the United States, the Federal Reserve will be less inclined to accelerate the number of rate cuts that it's been, the path that it started on, and subsequently there'll be a divergence in bond yields between Canada and the United States, and the loonie is likely to drop below 70 cents. Now, I've got to tell you, as we've spoken today, the spot rate for the loonie is almost, and we know this is not just specific to the Canadian currency, but to other currencies as well. The United States dollar has been quite strong, which Mr. Trump isn't a fan of, but it's almost at 140 this afternoon. So what are your thoughts about just broader economic trends that impact Canada strongly having an impact on the overall relationship?
Well, the economic integration between Canada and the United States it cuts both ways. I think Canada's done better than a lot of other G7 countries in the last couple of years because the US has been able to maintain growth. That has spilled over in a way to Canada that in a way that it hasn't to other US trading partners.
Right.
Also, I think that the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve have done a remarkable job of maintaining exchange rate stability. You're right about the spot market, but overall, we've kept a relatively level head. And I don't know if I'm allowed to plug things on this podcast or this speaker series.
You go.
The Wilson Center has launched a Washington Forum on the Canadian economy, and you can find this on our Wilson Center website. We held a meeting earlier this year in which Tiff Macklem, the governor of the Bank of Canada, and Jerome Powell, the Federal Reserve Board chairman, met. They both presented, and they talked a lot about their relationship with each other, how often they're in communication. Jerome Powell talked about how carefully he watched the transcripts even of the rate announcements that were coming out of the Bank of Canada. And he obviously has a very high regard for Canada's monetary policy management. That coordination will continue, and I think it's a very strong signal for markets that these are two very linked currencies. I think that will help. Just as a footnote, if you do look for that, there's a moment in which Jerome Powell makes a comment about trade, which he normally doesn't talk about because that's not his area, but he talks about the export that Americans can't get enough of coming from Canada, that it's just remarkable when you look at the data, and that is exported comedians. And he lists his top 10 Canadian comedians who made it to the United States. Now, that's we also have a little Instagram version of that, so definitely look for that. It'll be the smile of your day. So that's the coordination side, and then kind of going from there to what that means for our relationship going forward. Canada and the US have been fairly close as they've moved along on most economic numbers because of that high degree of integration, but there's a big concern about productivity in Canada. And it's been lagging the productivity, say, numbers in the US, which is often an unfair comparison, which is much bigger, more diversified economy, but it's got a lot of Canadians concerned, and people worry about what that means for Canada's ability to sustain its level of growth, both in terms of population and otherwise. It's not a popular thing to say, but I think that we're on the cusp, going back to something I was saying earlier about the retirement of baby boomers in the American federal government. I think we're on the cusp of a debate about improving public sector productivity. AI, artificial intelligence, is going to be different than other aspects of, say, automation, which really hit blue collar jobs hard. It'll be white collar jobs that will be hit by a lot of AI. And we had a debate about public service reform going back to the 80s that was characterized as a sort of conservative race to the bottom, libertarian, get rid of government, that sort of thing. I think actually now, partly because of the technology we have, we need to begin to having a debate about getting better service at less cost. And I'd include in that time cost. So you look at something like the Keystone Pipeline, I know controversial, but that was a huge process, a huge project that tied up money for years that only released it at the end. It didn't end up with the pipeline that everybody wanted. Why does it take so long to permit products? Why do we spend so long? I mean, it's not about the end result. Decisions about how long we take to make it. How long does it take for you to get your taxes returned when you file? How long does it take for you to get the line at the Department of Motor Vehicles to get your driver's license? There are all these things we get from government that if you go to the private sector, you can go online and it's done in 2 seconds. And yet the government doesn't work that way. But I think the government's going to be under pressure to modernize and begin working that way. So that's going to lead to a real stress for public servants, but I think it's also an opportunity to improve the efficiency of the Canadian economy. And one idea that I'm very excited about, I know that's a very nerdy excitement, is an idea that's been kicking around, which is mutual recognition of the functional equivalence of regulatory systems. So for a lot of things, and one of the great examples are child safety seats for the back of your car. Canada and the US have slightly different standards. But if you want to move to Canada, one of the things they'll tell you is you have to buy a new child safety seat because CSA didn't certify that one. Well, the Canadian Standards Association. Well, but it's the same. The babies are the same. The cars we drive are the same. The roads are the same. So why do we have slightly different standards? Well, they're just path dependency. We set up different standards in the past. And so you want to make sure every product goes through double testing. But it's a waste of everyone's time and money. And as we start to look at small, medium-sized businesses, which are the generators of jobs for both our countries, the leading sort of job creator, I think we should change the relationship with regulators so that a Canadian running a business can get their product approved for the domestic market with the regulators they know, and then they get access to the entire US market because the standards are equivalent. Will we agree on everything? No. We won't, but we can agree on enough things that we can really ease some of the friction in our economy. And I think that'll be very helpful for us moving forward.
Thank you, Chris. The only part that I may choose to politely disagree on is the quality of the construction and design of roads in Canada versus the United States. As a Canadian who's lived in the United States for nearly 40 years, and having traveled a lot, the standard that is used in Canada is not the standard that's employed in the United States, that's for sure.
Well, I have to say Michigan roads are terrible. So New York is superior, but this is not a US-wide thing.
Very good, very good. Touche. Let me turn it back over to Amy Sutherland. Amy, please.
Wow, this is awesome. Thank you both, Dr. Kirkey and Dr. Sands, for sharing your perspectives during this conversations on Canada, and also to our virtual audience for submitting such wonderful questions. We're so grateful for you all being here and for your patience as we started a few moments after the hour earlier. So thanks for hanging in there with us. And we just want to say thanks to all our supporters. We're so grateful. I'm going to launch a poll. It's 4 questions. Would love your feedback on this. And I'm going to let you know also that the Institute on Quebec Studies at SUNY Plattsburgh is hosting an event next week. If you're around in our area, we'd love to have you join us. This is taking place on Tuesday, November 19 at 2 p.m. in Hopkins Hall. The Krinovitz Hall is our location for this event, with Mr. David Rouleau, who is the Quebec Delegate General in New York City, and he will be delivering the Distinguished Quebec Address. So we're thrilled to move on from this conversations on Canada to our next event, and hope you'll join us. Of course, we'll reach out to all of our interested mailing list subscribers with news of our next conversations on Canada, and look forward to seeing you there. So thanks everyone, and wishing you a wonderful rest of your day.